And this Sunday, we're getting you a mega India Today exclusive. We've pieced together the most detailed account of what happened on June 15th in the Galwan Valley between Indian and Chinese troops. Not one, but three separate brawls actually took place on June 15th. That's the day when we lost 20 of our soldiers, including Colonel Santosh Babu. They were martyred while battling the Chinese along the line of actual control. The Chinese troops that were deployed were in fact not regular troops that are usually deployed along the line of actual control. What we're also picking up at this point is details of the three separate brawls. One brawl, in fact, which is the second one between Indian and Chinese troops, that caused most of the casualties. This second brawl lasted nearly 45 minutes, and it is during this exchange that the bodies unfortunately really piled up. The brawl actually, in fact, separated into different groups with nearly 300 men actually fighting each other. And remember, there was no firing, it was actual fighting. It was using some arms and also with their fists. The third brawl began shortly after 11 p.m. and this also was on June 15th. Senior editor Shiva Roor is joining us with more details on this. Shiv, you've been able to access exclusive details of exactly what happened on June 15th. If you could just break it down for us.
Yes, it's a fairly detailed account that we've put out on India Today. It's already on the website as well, Akshita. But just to detail for our viewers the exclusive details that answer many of the questions, and I'll go through them one by one very quickly. Number one, this was a fight that took place definitely on the Chinese side. The fight started on the Indian side, about 20 meters from the line of actual control, when the Indian group questioned and then dismantled, an offending Chinese tent and outpost which had come over there. After which the fighting shifted to the Chinese side of the line of actual control because the Indian side suspected there was a larger game plan afoot, and this was actually confirmed by the larger numbers of Chinese troops that they met there. After that, at about 9 p.m., Colonel Babu, the commanding officer, was killed in the darkness by a stone. He received a head injury. He fell into the water. And like I said, there were three separate incidents of fighting. It wasn't one long stretch, as has been described by many. This was three separate, incidents of an escalation spread over about 5.5 hours, starting at about 7 o'clock and finishing closer to midnight. The other thing we know is that, and this is one of the most glaring aspects, Akshita, is that the Chinese troops who were engaged in this fighting were not the usual troops who are deployed in that particular sector by the Chinese army. These were apparently some different Chinese troops who'd been deployed there, possibly specifically for this kind of hostile action. They were diverted there late in May after a major military exercise by the Chinese in the Tibet area. The fourth very important aspect is the issue of the issue of the dead. Now, the debrief by the army. Remember, there is no official word on the Chinese casualties, but I'm talking about the debrief. And as the journalist who broke the Ladakh story, I have my sources on the ground. The debrief by the army of the situation, which is basically like a first information report, says that 16 Chinese personnel bodies were handed back to the Chinese during the disengagement immediately after the brawl. So in darkness, just before sun rose, 16 confirmed Chinese dead bodies were handed back to the Chinese. The other issue that has become an issue of controversy, but there was a bit of a blur and a little bit of confusion over it until General V.K. Singh yesterday commented on it and threw some light on it. My sources on the ground tell me that there was an exchange of personnel. Earlier, it was believed that 10 Indian men were captive by the Chinese and they were held captive as prisoner and then handed back. Now the truth comes out, and this is what is borne out by my sources on the ground, that it was indeed an exchange of men. They were not prisoners of war. It wasn't as simple as a captive hostage-like situation, if you understand, Akshita. It was much more nuanced than that. Because of the chaos of the fighting that took place in Galwan that night, many injured men remained with the other side. And the disengagement was so sudden and abrupt, those men remained, with the adversary, so to speak. One of the reassuring things is these injured men were being treated by the adversary. So the Indian soldiers were treating the injuries of the Chinese soldiers with them. The Chinese troops were treating injuries of the Indian soldiers, who were in their charge. And they didn't return them immediately because as the sun rose, the major generals took over. There was a lot of shock about what had happened, and therefore it became a military diplomatic situation. And that's the reason why it took 2 or 3 days before the men could be, exchanged at Patrol Point 14. So it was not a one-sided thing at all. It definitely happened on the Chinese side, and there were certainly casualties on both sides. I don't want to get into whether whose casualties were more, but 16 Chinese men were killed in the battle itself because their bodies were confirmed right there and handed back to the Chinese army. More could have perished later, but this was an extremely savage 5.5 hour battle, and these are the first time these details are coming out, and I hope they answer many of the questions.
Shiv, what you're telling us is so very important, because till now it was always understood to be a situation where our soldiers were held captive. But what you're telling us is essentially there were so many soldiers who were injured on both sides. We were treating Chinese soldiers, they were treating our soldiers. And you've also given us a very, very specific timeline. And I'm going through your exclusive report here, a very specific timeline of exactly what happened on June 15th. If you could just explain for us exactly how things panned out during the second brawl, and why things escalated so quickly to what it became, to, of course, that clash.
That's a great question, because it is that second phase of the fighting in which most of the casualties were actually inflicted, Akshita, and also where Colonel Santosh Babu, was killed in action. After the Indian team of about 35 men, dismantled the Chinese tent which was on the Indian side, and this is after temperatures had also risen because the first punch was thrown by the Chinese. In that particular camp on the Indian side, there were Chinese officers as well. So it was immediately believed that there was something larger afoot, and therefore a call was taken by Colonel Babu and his men to cross the line of actual control, go into the Chinese side to make sure that there was no larger plan to come inside, because they had a suspicion that there was a larger game plan and there could be more troops waiting there to intrude into India. And obviously that suspicion was completely validated, because once they crossed, and we don't know what distance, but it must have been a fair distance into the Chinese side, because they immediately came under attack after about half a kilometer. So their suspicions were borne out very closely. The fact that they immediately came under attack once they were there, also shows that this was in many ways premeditated. That part is completely borne out. But the first punch, the provocation, the fact that the Chinese were completely ready for this kind of thing is borne out by the way it happened. But the fact that the damage, the bloodletting happened on both sides is borne out from the fact that the Indian colonel, used his brains, kept a cool head, led from the front, and took a calculated decision to enter Chinese-held territory and, take the fight directly to their soil, because he didn't want that happening on Indian soil, because then he knew that if a disengagement happened after that, the Chinese soldiers might just squat there, while the politicians and the mandarins take over. So he took that tactical decision, and that's one of the reasons why there are no Chinese on Indian soil. There was no intrusion, and that also gave the confidence to Prime Minister Modi for making that categorical statement, a few days later, Akshita.
This gives so much more clarity on exactly what happened on June 15th, and also the statements that have come in thereafter from the government. Shiv, thank you for joining us with that exclusive news break.